I sat in the back row and clapped while my boss stood on a stage, under a spotlight, presenting my idea as his own. He didn't know one thing: 3 months before he ever saw my prototype, I'd already filed the patent. This isn't a story about anger. It's a story about receipts, and about what happens when you let a thief get comfortable before you close the trap. Stay till the end, because the text message that ends his career is still on file, and I still, to this day, know exactly where I keep it. My name is Sienna Okafor, and I found out my idea had a new father the same week I found out my coffee maker had a leak. Honestly, of the two betrayals, the coffee maker upset me less. I was 2 years into my job at Brightloom Technologies, a mid-size consumer tech company that made, depending on the quarter, either genuinely useful home devices or expensive plastic that beeps. When I built a working prototype of something I'd been sketching on napkins for the better part of a year, a smart irrigation sensor that could predict a plant's water needs 3 days in advance by reading soil conductivity patterns instead of just moisture levels, which meant it could actually prevent root rot instead of just reacting to it after the damage was already done. I called it, with the kind of unearned confidence only a caffeinated engineer at 11 p.m. can summon, the Root Prophet. I want you to understand how much of myself went into that name, into that device, before you understand what it cost me to watch someone else's mouth say it out loud to a room full of strangers as if he had thought of it in the shower. I had spent the better part of a year on it, nights and weekends spent hunched over a workbench crammed into the corner of my studio apartment, soldering iron humming, coffee going cold beside me, sketches accumulating in a growing stack of napkins and notebook pages until the idea finally, after months of failed prototypes, clicked into something that actually worked. I remember the exact night it finally read correctly, 2:14 a.m. on a Thursday, the little display flickering to life with an accurate 3-day prediction window, and me sitting alone on my kitchen floor, laughing out loud at nothing, at no one, just at the sheer disbelieving joy of having built something real out of nothing but stubbornness and bad sleep. I showed it to exactly one person outside my own apartment, my direct manager, a man named Marcus Fenwick, who had the specific charisma of someone who'd once read a book about charisma and was still, 3 years later, practicing the exercises. Marcus had a corner office, a standing desk he never once stood at, and a habit of saying "let's circle back" about things he had absolutely no intention of circling back to, unless those things turned out, upon further reflection, to be personally useful to him. "This is really something, Sienna," he said, turning my prototype over in his hands like a man appraising a house he intended to buy out from under someone who didn't yet know it was for sale. "I want to bring this to the product team. Get you some real visibility." I want to be clear that I believed him. I had worked under Marcus for 2 years by that point, had watched him take credit for exactly enough small things, a phrase here, a suggestion there, that I should have known better than to trust him with something this large. But he had also, on 2 prior occasions, genuinely advocated for a junior engineer's idea in a room I wasn't allowed into, and some hopeful, exhausted part of me, the part that had been working 60-hour weeks and desperately wanted someone senior to finally see what I was capable of, decided this would be the 3rd time. It was not the 3rd time. 6 weeks later, I sat in the very back row of Brightloom Technologies' quarterly innovation showcase, an event I attended every year in the specific, well-worn role of engineer who claps for other people's slides, and watched Marcus Fenwick walk onto the main stage, under a spotlight, in front of the entire company and 2 members of the board, and present Fensense, a smart irrigation sensor that predicted plant water needs 3 days in advance by reading soil conductivity patterns. He had changed the name. He had not changed the housing design, the sensor array configuration, or, and I want to be very specific about this part, because it's the detail that still makes my hands go cold when I think about it, the actual internal wiring diagram, which I recognized instantly, because I had drawn it myself, on a napkin, at 11 p.m., in my own apartment, in my own handwriting, some evidence of which, it would later become extremely relevant to note, I had already photographed. This represents, Marcus said, to a room of 400 people, gesturing at a device I had built with my own 2 hands over 3 sleepless weekends, exactly the kind of forward-thinking innovation Brightloom Technologies is known for. I sat in the back row and clapped, because that was, apparently, still my job, and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very, very still, a stillness I would later come to recognize, in hindsight, as the exact moment something inside me stopped being hurt and started, instead, being strategic. I want to explain why I didn't stand up in that auditorium and scream, because I have imagined it, many times since, in vivid and satisfying detail, rising from my seat, my voice cutting through Marcus's practiced cadence, the whole room turning to stare. It would have been satisfying, briefly. And it would have accomplished absolutely nothing, because here is the thing about corporate idea theft that nobody tells you until you're living it, without documentation, without a paper trail, without something more concrete than "I remember drawing this on a napkin." It is your word against a man with a corner office, a standing desk, and, as I would soon learn, a well-practiced habit of very deliberately choosing junior engineers who didn't have the resources to fight back. So instead of screaming, I went home that evening, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for an occasion I no longer had reason to celebrate, and did what I do when I'm furious in a way too large for tears. I made a list. Item 1. I had photographed the original napkin sketch, timestamped, 6 weeks before the showcase, because I photograph everything, a habit my roommate calls faintly unsettling and I call professionally responsible. Item 2. I had emailed the prototype's full specs to my own personal email address, not to any company system, personal notes, dated, sent from my apartment, on a weekend, discussing what I'd titled, in the subject line, Root Profit, Irrigation Project, Personal. Item 3, and this was the one that made me sit up very straight on my kitchen floor at 1 a.m, wine glass forgotten on the counter. I had, 3 full months before I ever showed the prototype to Marcus, filed a provisional patent application. I want to explain why, because it makes me sound considerably more prepared, more calculating, than I actually was at the time. I hadn't filed it because I suspected Marcus would steal my work. I filed it because my father, a retired patent attorney who had spent 30 years watching brilliant, trusting engineers get robbed blind by exactly this kind of charismatic corner office nonsense, had one piece of advice he'd repeated to me so often growing up that it had become something close to a family motto, recited over dinner tables and graduation dinners and every proud, cautious phone call in between: file first, trust later. In that order, and never, ever the other way around. I had filed the provisional patent for the Root Profit's core mechanism, the conductivity-based prediction algorithm, the specific sensor array design, under my own name, using my own savings, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, before I had ever mentioned the idea to a single soul at Brightloom Technologies. Marcus did not know that. Marcus, as far as I could tell from 2 years of watching him skim past legal briefings with visible, performative boredom, did not know patents existed outside of the ones the company's legal team occasionally mentioned in meetings he wasn't paying attention to. I finished my wine, closed my laptop, and went to bed with the specific, dangerous calm of a woman who has just realized she is not, in fact, out of moves. I need to tell you something, I said, calling my father the next morning, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. And I need you to not say, "I told you so," until I've finished explaining. I make no promises, my father said. He had been retired for 2 years by then and had, in that time, developed an alarming enthusiasm for hypothetical legal scenarios he no longer got paid to work on professionally, which meant this particular phone call was, for him, essentially a Christmas gift arriving several months early. I told him everything: the prototype, Marcus, the showcase, the standing ovation from the board, the wine, the provisional patent I'd filed 8 months earlier on his advice, which I had genuinely, at the time, considered mostly a formality, an exercise in being careful rather than any kind of concrete plan. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, the particular silence of a man doing rapid mental arithmetic on a lifetime of professional experience, and then my father said, with the specific reverence of a man watching his life's work come full circle, "Sienna. Sweetheart. Tell me you kept the filing receipt." "I kept everything, Dad. I photograph everything." "You raised me to photograph everything." "I am," my father said, his voice thick with something that might have been pride and might have been tears, "the proudest I have ever been in my entire life, and I include your college graduation in that ranking, and you gave the valedictorian speech that year. Can we focus, please?" "Right. Yes. Okay." I could hear him settling into his old leather desk chair, the one he'd refused to get rid of despite retirement, because, as he liked to put it, a man needs somewhere to sit while he's thinking about ruining someone. "Here's what we do. First, do not tell Marcus, do not tell anyone at Brightloom Technologies, that you have a patent filed. Not yet. The moment they know, they lawyer up, they try to buy you out quietly, or worse, they try to argue prior company ownership under some clause buried in your employment contract that you signed on day one and never actually read, which, did you read your employment contract, Sienna?" "I read parts of it." "We'll deal with that separately. Second, we need to let this play out publicly, a little. Let Marcus get comfortable. Let him take this to the board, get budget approved, maybe even let FinCENS get further into development, because the more money and reputation he's put behind stealing your idea, the more devastating it is when we prove, in writing, that it was never his to steal in the first place. Third, and here my father's voice took on the specific gleam I recognized from childhood, the exact tone he used to have right before he'd explain, at length and with genuine, undisguised joy, some devious legal maneuver he'd once used to win a case. "Third, we find you a lawyer who isn't me, because I'm retired and also, I'll admit, emotionally compromised on your behalf. But I know exactly who to call." I want to be honest about how difficult the following 11 weeks were, because revenge stories tend to skip past the waiting, editing it down to a single satisfying montage, and the waiting was, genuinely, the hardest part of the entire ordeal. I watched Marcus Fenwick get promoted to Senior Director of Product Innovation off the back of FinCEN's glowing board reception, his name suddenly attached to congratulatory company-wide emails, his corner office upgraded to an even larger corner office on a higher floor. I watched him get profiled in an industry newsletter under the breathless headline "Brightloom Technologies Rising Star Reimagines Home Irrigation." I watched him present FinCENS at a regional tech conference, where he told an audience of 300 people, with a completely straight face, that the idea had come to him during a hike, watching how differently plants responded to rain versus irrigation, a story so specifically, aggressively fictional that I nearly threw my laptop across my apartment when a coworker forwarded me the clip, laughing, with the caption, "LOL, remember when you built this at your kitchen table." I attended every single meeting where FinCENS came up. I clapped, again and again, in the specific role I'd been assigned, engineer who claps, and I said nothing, and I photographed everything, and I met with my new attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Renata Diaz, whom my father had described as the only person I've ever met who scares me a little, professionally speaking, and I mean that as the highest compliment. Every other week, in a small coffee shop 2 towns over, chosen specifically because no one from Brightloom Technologies ever went there. "You're doing the hardest part exactly right," Renata told me, around week 7, reviewing the timeline of evidence I'd carefully assembled: the photographed napkin sketch, the personal emails, the provisional patent filing receipt, the full patent application I'd since filed to formalize the claim, and the piece that made Renata actually smile, which I'd learned by then was rare, precious, and worth documenting on its own: an internal Slack message Marcus had sent to another engineer, 6 days before the showcase, that read, in its entirety, "Just need to tweak the housing enough that it doesn't look identical to the original. Don't want anyone asking questions." That message had been quietly, anonymously forwarded to me 2 months into this whole ordeal by an engineer named Theo Marsh, a nervous, decent man who clearly hadn't wanted any part of what he'd witnessed, with a note attached that simply said, "I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner." That message alone, Renata said, tapping the screen with one finger, her expression something close to delighted, is nearly a confession. He knew the design was recognizable. He knew it wasn't his. And he made a deliberate, documented choice to obscure that instead of disclosing it. "So we're ready?" "Almost," Renata said, closing her laptop with the calm precision of someone who had already mapped out every remaining move. "Vincennes is about to enter its full commercial launch. Brightloom's putting serious marketing money behind it, a nationwide retail rollout, partnerships with 2 major garden supply chains. I want to wait until that launch is fully underway. Until the financial exposure is at its absolute peak. Because right now, if we sue, Brightloom Technologies settles quietly, reissues Vincennes under a licensing agreement, and Marcus Fenwick keeps his corner office with a small asterisk next to his name that nobody outside the legal department ever sees. I don't want a quiet settlement, Sienna. I want a headline." I looked at her, and felt, for the first time in 7 long weeks, something that wasn't just exhausted anger, something closer, unexpectedly, to excitement. "You're enjoying this," I said. "I am," Renata admitted, without a trace of apology. "I don't often get a case this clean. Usually it's messy, ambiguous, both sides have some claim to stand on. This one isn't ambiguous at all." He photographed his own guilt and sent it to a coworker. "This is, professionally speaking, a gift." Vincennes launched nationwide on a Tuesday in October, with a press event at Brightloom Technologies headquarters that I attended, per my usual role, in the back row, clapping, while Marcus Fenwick, now sporting a considerably nicer suit than the one I remembered from 2 years of budget meetings, stood on a stage decorated with fake ivy and actual, working prototypes of the device I had built alone, in my apartment, over 3 sleepless weekends that he would never once acknowledge or even properly understand. "This device represents a fundamental leap forward," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily through the sound system, "in how we think about sustainable home gardening." I sat in the audience, phone resting quietly in my lap, and watched the confirmation email land in my inbox from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. My full patent, for the conductivity-based prediction algorithm and sensor array design underlying the root profit, had been officially granted 3 days earlier. I had it in writing. I had it dated. And Marcus Fenwick, standing under a spotlight in front of 2 garden supply chain executives and a room full of journalists, had absolutely no idea. Renata filed the lawsuit the following Monday. I want to describe, in some careful detail, what it is like to watch a cease and desist letter and a patent infringement lawsuit detonate inside a mid-sized tech company, because it is, and I say this with the specific, well-earned glee of a woman who spent 11 weeks clapping in the back row while someone else took credit for her work, one of the most satisfying things I have ever personally witnessed. The first sign was an all-staff email from HR, sent at 8:47 a.m., with the subject line a note on recent developments, a phrase so aggressively vague it might as well have been written by a man standing over a smoking crater, insisting to anyone who'd listen that everything was, in fact, entirely fine. The second sign was Marcus Fenwick not showing up to the 10 a.m. product meeting, which I attended, as always, in the back row, and which was, for the first time in 11 weeks, conducted entirely without any mention of consents, replaced instead by a strange, brittle silence that I found, personally, extremely restorative, the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath finally being let out. The third sign, and this one I did not witness directly, but heard about within the hour, from no fewer than 4 separate co-workers, all relaying it with the specific breathless energy of people who understood they were watching corporate history happen in real time, was Marcus Fenwick getting called into an emergency meeting with the company's general counsel, and emerging, 40 minutes later, the color of unbaked bread. By lunch, the retail partnerships had gone quiet. Both garden supply chains, upon being contacted by Renata's office regarding the active infringement suit, had immediately paused shipment of Fensense products, citing supply chain reassessment, which was, everyone in the industry understood, corporate code for we are not touching this until the lawsuit resolves, and possibly not even then. By the end of the week, Brightloom Technologies stock, a modest, unremarkable stock that nobody outside the company had ever had particularly strong feelings about, dropped 4% on the news, cited in an industry trade publication under the headline Brightloom Technologies faces patent infringement suit over flagship product, internal sources allege employee IP theft. I did not write that headline. I want to be very clear about that. But I did, upon reading it, allow myself exactly 1 glass of celebratory wine, alone, on my kitchen floor, in the same spot where the entire plan had first been born 11 weeks earlier. The deposition took place 2 months later, in a conference room considerably less impressive than Marcus's old corner office, and I want to describe it in some detail, because I had waited a long time to watch it happen and I intend, even now, to savor the retelling. Marcus sat across the table from Renata, flanked by 2 Brightloom Technologies attorneys who had the specific exhausted energy of people who'd already read the evidence file in full and understood, professionally, that they were not walking into a fight they could win, they were walking into damage control, and not particularly effective damage control at that. Mr. Fenwick, Renata said, sliding a printed photo across the table, her voice level and unhurried, "Can you identify this document?" Marcus looked at it for a long moment. It was the napkin. My napkin. Photographed, timestamped, 6 weeks before the innovation showcase, with my own handwriting clearly, unmistakably visible across the wiring diagram. "I don't recognize this specifically," Marcus said carefully, and I watched, from my seat beside Renata, the particular strain in his voice of a man reciting a line he'd rehearsed and already sensed wasn't going to hold. "You don't recognize the original hand-drawn schematic for the exact sensor array design featured in Fensense, a schematic timestamped 6 weeks before you presented that product to the Brightloom Technologies board as your own original work?" That's not, the housing design was different. "The housing design was cosmetically altered," Renata said, sliding a second document across the table, "which we know, Mr. Fenwick, because of this message you sent to a colleague 6 days before the showcase. Would you like me to read it aloud, or would you prefer to read it yourself?" I watched Marcus read his own words back to himself. "Just need to tweak the housing enough that it doesn't look identical to the original, don't want anyone asking questions," and I watched something in his face collapse, slowly, the specific collapse of a man realizing, in real time, that every clever thing he'd once done to cover his tracks had been photographed, forwarded, dated, and was now sitting in a folder in front of him with his own name attached to every line of it. I'd like to take a break, Marcus said quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes. Of course, Renata said, closing her folder with the specific, unhurried calm of a woman who had, in fact, expected exactly this outcome and had budgeted a comfortable 45 minutes for it in her afternoon. I want to be honest about something. I did not sue Marcus Fenwick personally into bankruptcy through sheer legal force alone, and I think it's important to explain the actual mechanism, because sued him into bankruptcy sounds, on its face, like a single dramatic courtroom moment, and the reality was considerably messier, slower, and, in its own strange way, more satisfying than any single verdict could have been. The patent infringement suit against Brightloom Technologies settled 8 months after it was filed, for an amount that Renata described, with visible professional pride, as generational, a figure large enough that I want to describe it only in the vaguest possible terms, out of some lingering, old-fashioned instinct not to discuss money too specifically, except to say that it was enough to buy my own building, fund my own lab, and never once worry, ever again, about a corner office charmer stealing another napkin sketch. But the settlement with Brightloom Technologies was not, itself, what ended Marcus Fenwick. Brightloom Technologies, once the lawsuit's terms were finalized, did what large companies do when an employee's misconduct has cost them millions of dollars and a devastating headline in an industry trade publication. They turned around and sued Marcus Fenwick personally, for breach of his employment contract's IP disclosure clauses, for the internal costs of the failed FinSense launch, for reputational damages, and, this was the part one found almost poetic, almost too neat to be true, for indemnification of the settlement they'd just been forced to pay me. Marcus, it turned out, did not have generational wealth of his own to draw on. He had a corner office, a standing desk he never once stood at, a modest home he'd recently refinanced to cover the mortgage on a lake house he'd bought during his brief, glittering tenure as Senior Director of Product Innovation, and, once Brightloom Technologies' internal suit and legal fees were finished with him, considerably less than nothing. He filed for personal bankruptcy 14 months after that innovation showcase where I'd sat in the back row and clapped for my own stolen idea. I did not attend the bankruptcy filing. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the satisfying thing to do is show up, watch him sign the paperwork, deliver some devastating final line straight to his face. I didn't do that. I found, once the settlement cleared and my own lab was funded and my own name was finally on my own patent, framed and hanging on my own wall, that I didn't actually need to watch him lose to feel like I'd won. I had already won, quietly, 8 months before the bankruptcy filing, the exact moment my patent confirmation email landed in my inbox while he stood on a stage under fake ivy, congratulating himself on a fundamental leap forward he had never, in any real sense, actually made. I want to take a moment to talk about Theo Marsh, the nervous, decent engineer who forwarded me Marcus's incriminating Slack message 2 months into my quiet campaign, because I think his part in this story matters more than a footnote, more than a passing mention. I found out, months later, over coffee, the same coffee shop 2 towns over where Renata and I had met for 11 weeks straight, which had, by that point, become something close to a second office for me, that Theo had known about Marcus's habit of borrowing junior engineers' ideas for close to 3 years before I ever showed up in the room. He'd watched it happen to 2 other people before me, both of whom had left the company quietly, discouraged, never quite able to prove what they knew, in their bones, had happened to them. I should have said something the first time, Theo told me, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, unable, for a moment, to meet my eyes. Or the second. I told myself I would if it happened again, and then it happened again, to you, and I still almost didn't do anything, because I was scared what it would cost me. What made you finally send it? Theo considered the question for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone quiet, careful, like he was handing me something fragile. "I watched you clap in the back row," he said finally. "Every single meeting. For 11 weeks. And I kept waiting for you to look angry, or defeated, or like you'd given up entirely, and you never did. You just kept clapping and taking notes and showing up, like you knew something the rest of us didn't. It scared me a little, honestly. It made me think, if she's not panicking, maybe I shouldn't be either. Maybe there's something worth trusting there. So I sent the message. I offered Theo a position at my new lab 6 months later, once it was fully funded and fully staffed and no longer just an idea I'd been sketching on napkins in the smaller hours of the night. He accepted within an hour of the offer, which I found, given everything that had passed between us, entirely appropriate. My lab, Larkspur Labs, named for my grandmother's favorite flower, chosen specifically because I wanted my own name attached to nothing that could ever again be quietly reassigned to someone else's, sits 4 blocks from what used to be Brightloom Technologies headquarters, which closed its consumer products division entirely 18 months after the settlement, unable to recover the reputational and financial damage of a lawsuit that made industry headlines for the better part of a year. The root profit, under its original name, exactly as I'd first written it on that napkin at 11 p.m. on a Thursday, half delirious with caffeine and the particular joy of something finally working, launched under my own company 2 years after that first ruined innovation showcase, with a modest, honest marketing campaign that made no claims about hikes or rainstorms or sudden creative epiphanies. Just a straightforward explanation of the technology, and a photograph, printed directly on the packaging itself, of the original napkin sketch, timestamped, in my own handwriting, because I decided, somewhere in the middle of all of it, that I wanted the origin story told honestly from the very beginning this time, by me, and only me. I still have the napkin. It's framed now, hanging in my office, next to my father's old patent bar certificate, which he gave me the week the lawsuit settled, along with the single greatest piece of advice he has ever offered me, delivered over a celebratory dinner with the specific reverence of a man passing down a family motto to the next generation. "File first," he said, raising his glass, his eyes bright in a way I'd rarely seen. "Trust later. And always, always, keep the receipts." I keep the receipts. Every single one. Photographed, timestamped, filed carefully away, not out of paranoia anymore, but out of something closer to habit, the quiet, permanent discipline of a woman who spent 11 weeks clapping in the back row for her own stolen idea, and never intends to clap for anyone else's theft again. As for Marcus Fenwick, I heard, secondhand, through an industry acquaintance who still ran in those circles, that he'd taken a job doing sales for a garden supply company, the exact kind of company that had once carried Fincents on its shelves before pulling it in a single, devastating afternoon. I found, upon hearing this, that I felt considerably less satisfaction than I'd expected to feel, and considerably more of something else entirely, the specific, quiet peace of a woman who no longer needed his downfall to feel like her own life had finally, fully become hers. I built something. He took it. I proved it was mine, in writing, filed and dated and impossible to argue with. And in the end, that turned out to be the only ending I actually needed, not his suffering, not the schadenfreude of a stranger's downfall, just the simple, undeniable fact of my own name attached, permanently, to something I had built with my own 2 hands. I want to be honest that this took me some time to arrive at. In the early months, right after the lawsuit settled, I imagined a version of satisfaction that looked like watching him lose everything up close, a front row seat to his ruin, the mirror image of the back row seat I'd been forced to occupy for 11 long weeks. But as the months passed, and my own lab took shape, and my own team began filling the space I'd once only imagined on napkins, I found that the anger I'd carried for so long had quietly, gradually, transformed into something lighter. Not forgiveness, exactly, I don't think I owe him that, and I don't think I ever will. But something closer to indifference, the specific, hard-won indifference of a person who has built a life large enough that there's simply no room left in it for someone who never deserved to take up space there in the first place. There are a few things I know now that I didn't know 2.5 years ago, sitting at my workbench, soldering iron humming, entirely unaware of what was coming. I know now that trust and documentation are not opposites. My father's motto, file first, trust later, sounds, on its surface, like a rule for cynics, for people who've given up on believing in anyone. But I've come to understand it differently. Filing first isn't a refusal to trust. It's simply an acknowledgement that trust, however genuine, doesn't erase the need for proof, that the two can, and should, exist side by side. I trusted Marcus, in my own way, right up until the moment he stood on that stage. My trust didn't make me foolish. What would have made me foolish was having no receipts to fall back on when that trust turned out to be misplaced. I know now that patience, real patience, the kind that requires you to sit in a back row and clap for 11 straight weeks while someone else takes credit for your work, is not the same as passivity. It felt, in the moment, unbearably passive. It felt, some days, like a kind of surrender. But it wasn't. It was the hardest, most deliberate work I've ever done, harder in its own way than building the prototype itself, because it required me to hold my anger perfectly still, to let it inform my strategy without letting it drive my actions, until the exact right moment arrived to finally let it loose. And I know now, more than anything else, that the people who quietly notice, the theos of the world, watching from the sidelines, unsure whether to speak up, are watching more closely than we often realize. My composure in that back row wasn't performance. It was survival. But it turned out to also be, without my ever intending it, a kind of invitation, proof to someone else, watching silently, that there was something worth trusting on the other side of speaking up. There's a piece of this story I didn't fully understand until much later, one I only learned by accident, nearly a year after the settlement, at an industry mixer I attended reluctantly, mostly because Renata insisted it would be good for Larkspur Labs to have a visible presence. A woman named Delfino Coro approached me near the drinks table, introducing herself as someone who'd worked at Brightloom Technologies briefly, years before I'd joined, in the same product division Marcus had eventually come to run. She recognized my name from the trade press coverage, and after a few minutes of pleasant, unremarkable small talk, her expression shifted into something more careful. "I don't know if this means anything to you now," she said, "but I want you to know you weren't the first person I heard about this happening to. I left Brightloom 4 years before you ever started, and even then, there were whispers about Marcus and how he handled junior engineers' ideas. Nothing anyone could ever prove. Just a pattern people talked about quietly, in the break room, and then stopped talking about, because nothing ever came of it." I felt something complicated move through me, hearing that, a strange mixture of vindication and a fresh, retroactive kind of anger on behalf of every person who'd apparently absorbed this same theft before me, without ever getting the chance I'd had to fight back. "Did anyone ever try to report it?" I asked. "Once, that I know of," Delphine said. "A woman named Farah, in the design team, back before my time even, tried to go to HR about a UI concept Marcus had presented as his own. She had no documentation, nothing beyond her own memory of the meetings. HR essentially told her it was a matter of interpretation, that ideas evolve collaboratively, that there was no way to prove intent. She left the company about 6 months later. I heard she still works in the industry, somewhere on the West Coast now. I thought about Farah for a long time after that conversation, a woman I had never met, whose name I hadn't known existed until a chance encounter at a mixer I'd almost skipped. I thought about how many people, over how many years, had likely quietly absorbed some version of what happened to me, without the specific, almost accidental combination of a retired patent attorney father and a habit of photographing napkins that had let me fight back successfully where they couldn't. It didn't diminish what I'd accomplished. But it did complicate the satisfaction of it, layering in something closer to responsibility, a recognition that my victory, however earned, however deserved, had also been made possible by resources not everyone has access to. Not everyone has a father who spent 30 years in patent law. Not everyone has the specific, slightly obsessive documentation habits that turned out, in my case, to be the difference between winning and simply becoming another quiet whisper in a break room. I found Farah's contact information a few weeks later, through a mutual connection Delphine helped me track down, and I sent her a short, careful message, not an invitation to relitigate old grief, but a simple acknowledgement that I'd heard what happened to her, that I believed her, and that if she was ever interested in speaking to what patent documentation could have done differently in her case, I'd be glad to connect her with Renata, free of charge. She wrote back, eventually, thanking me, telling me she'd made peace with it long ago but that it meant something to be believed, even years later, by a stranger who'd lived through her own version of the same story. That exchange taught me something I hadn't expected to learn from any part of this ordeal, that the receipts I'd kept weren't just protection for myself. They were, in some small way, a kind of testimony on behalf of everyone who'd come before me without them. I haven't mentioned my mother much in this story, mostly because she stayed quietly, deliberately in the background of the whole ordeal, the way she has always managed difficult things in our family, present, attentive, but rarely the one speaking loudest in the room. She called me the week the settlement was finalized, not to celebrate exactly, but to check in, the way she always did during the hardest stretches of my life, going back to childhood's scraped knees and later, harder things. "Your father's been insufferable about this," she said, and I could hear the fondness underneath the complaint. "He's told the story of your patent filing to at least 4 different people at the grocery store." I had to remind him yesterday that not everyone needs the full timeline while we're choosing produce. I laughed, the first easy laugh I'd had in what felt like months, the tension of the deposition and the settlement negotiations finally, slowly beginning to loosen its grip on my shoulders. "I'm glad it's over," I told her. "Is it, though?" she asked, gently, in the particular tone she used when she wanted me to think more carefully about something I'd said too quickly. "Over, I mean. Or is it just the part that involved lawyers being over?" I sat with that question for a moment, turning it over the way she'd clearly intended me to. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I think there's still work left. Not legal work. Just figuring out how to trust people again, maybe. Or how to trust the right people, anyway, without assuming everyone's Marcus. That's the part one wants you to be careful with," my mother said. "Your father's advice is good advice: file first, trust later, keep your receipts." I don't disagree with any of it. But I don't want you to walk away from this thinking trust itself was the mistake. The mistake was trusting the wrong man. Not trusting, period. There's a version of healing from this where you protect yourself so completely that you never let anyone close enough to matter again. That's not healing. That's just a different kind of wound, wearing armor instead of a bandage. I think about that conversation often, now, whenever I catch myself hesitating before sharing a new idea with someone at Larkspur Labs, that old, hard-won instinct rising, document first, trust later, always, and I try to remember my mother's addendum to my father's motto, that the goal was never to stop trusting people entirely, only to trust more wisely, more carefully, with my eyes open and my receipts filed, but with my heart, eventually, still capable of believing in someone new. I want to tell you about the one thing that never happened in this story, because I think its absence matters as much as everything that did. Marcus Fenwick never apologized to me. Not during the deposition, not after the settlement, not in the 14 months between the showcase and his bankruptcy filing. I used to think, in the early weeks after that first devastating night on my kitchen floor, that some part of this whole ordeal would eventually deliver me an apology, that somewhere in the wreckage of lawsuits and depositions and collapsed retail partnerships, Marcus would finally look me in the eye and admit what he'd done, and that admission would function as a kind of closing bracket on the whole experience, a final piece that let me set it down for good. It never came. And for a long time, I thought I needed it, that without it, some part of the story would remain permanently unfinished, some door left slightly open that I couldn't fully close. I understand now that I was wrong about that. The apology I was waiting for was never actually the thing that would have healed me. The patent was. The settlement was. Renata's calm, unshakable competence in that deposition room was. Theo's quiet courage was. My father's voice on the phone, giddy with pride, was. None of those things required Marcus's participation at all. They were things I built, or things other people gave me freely, entirely independent of whether the man who'd wronged me ever found it in himself to say he was sorry. I stopped waiting for that apology somewhere around the time my lab's doors opened for the first time, and I watched Theo set up his workstation in the corner, and I realized that the life growing around me had absolutely nothing left in it that depended on Marcus Fenwick's remorse. He didn't owe me an apology to make my life good. I had already made it good, brick by careful brick, receipt by careful receipt, entirely on my own. I want to tell you about the first day Larkspur Labs officially opened, because I think it's the scene that actually closes this story, more than any deposition or any bankruptcy filing ever could. It was a Monday morning in early spring, unremarkable weather, nothing dramatic about the sky or the light, just an ordinary morning that happened to be the one where I unlocked the front door of a building with my own name quietly attached to the deed, and walked into a space that had, until recently, existed only as a number in a settlement agreement and a series of increasingly detailed sketches in my own personal notebook. Theo arrived first, precisely on time, carrying a box of his own equipment and, somewhat unexpectedly, a small potted plant, which he set down on his new desk with a quiet, almost ceremonial care. "For luck," he said, catching me watching him. Also because I figured a company built around plant sensors should probably have an actual plant somewhere in the building. I laughed, and something in my chest, some old, tight knot I hadn't even fully realized I was still carrying, loosened slightly. Renata stopped by around noon, technically just to drop off some final paperwork related to the building's incorporation documents, but she stayed for nearly 2 hours, sitting on an upturned equipment crate because we hadn't yet ordered furniture for the break room, drinking coffee out of a paper cup and looking, for the first time since I'd met her, genuinely relaxed rather than professionally sharp. "You did this," she said, gesturing around the half-empty, echoing space, the exposed wiring still waiting to be finished, the boxes still unpacked in the corner. "I want you to actually sit with that for a second. Not the settlement. Not the lawsuit. This. You built this." I did sit with it, for a long moment, looking around at the bare walls that would, within a year, hold my framed napkin sketch and my father's patent certificate and photographs of a team that didn't exist yet but was already, somehow, beginning to feel real. My father called that evening, predictably, wanting a full report, and I found myself, walking through the empty building after everyone else had gone home, giving him a detailed tour over the phone, describing the workbench where the next generation of prototypes would eventually take shape, the corner where Theo's small plant already sat, the exact spot near the entrance where I planned to hang the napkin once it was properly framed. "You know," my father said, his voice quieter than I expected, "I filed my first patent for a client 31 years ago. I still remember the exact feeling of it, watching something someone built with their own hands finally get protected, on paper, in a way nobody could argue with. I've had that feeling maybe a dozen times in 3 decades of practice. Nothing close to what I feel right now, listening to you describe a building with your own name on it." I stood alone in the empty lab, phone pressed to my ear, and let myself cry a little, not the sharp, disorienting tears of that first night on my kitchen floor, but something gentler, something closer to relief, the particular exhausted joy of finally, after 2.5 years, arriving somewhere solid. "Thank you for the advice," I told him. "File first. Trust later. And keep the receipts," he added, and I could hear, even through the phone, that he was smiling. "Always, always keep the receipts." 11 weeks of clapping in the back row. One patent filed months before he ever saw the prototype. And one coworker who finally found the courage to send an email that changed everything. If you're reading this, and you recognize yourself in my story, in the idea that vanished from your hands and reappeared, slightly renamed, in someone else's mouth, in the specific, cold stillness of watching someone else take credit for something you built alone, at your own kitchen table, on your own exhausted nights, I want you to know something. Document everything. Not because you're paranoid, not because you assume the worst of everyone around you, but because the truth deserves proof, and proof is the only thing that turns your word into something undeniable. File first. Trust later. Keep the receipts, even when it feels excessive, even when no one around you understands why you're photographing a napkin at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. You may never need them. But if you do, you'll be glad, beyond words, that you had them ready. I think, too, about the version of this advice that goes beyond patents and prototypes, because I've come to believe it applies to almost every kind of theft, not just the corporate kind. Keep records of your own worth. Keep evidence, even if only in your own memory, of the moment someone showed you exactly who they were, so that later, when they try to rewrite the story in their own favor, you have something solid to hold on to besides your own doubt. Betrayal, of any kind, thrives in the space where the victim isn't sure what actually happened. Don't leave that space empty. Fill it, deliberately, with proof, of your work, of your worth, of the truth as it actually occurred, not as anyone else later tries to tell it. And if you find yourself in that back row, clapping for something that was never supposed to belong to anyone but you, know that stillness isn't the same as surrender. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait, quietly, patiently, gathering everything you need, until the moment arrives when the truth can no longer be argued with. That waiting will feel, some days, indistinguishable from giving up. It isn't. It is, in fact, the exact opposite, the slow, deliberate construction of a case so complete that when you finally do speak, you won't need to raise your voice at all. The evidence will speak for you, louder and more permanently than any single outburst ever could. I built something. Someone tried to take it. And in the end, the only thing that mattered was that I had already, quietly, proven it was mine. Tell me, could you have waited that long, or would you have confronted him on day one? I'll leave that question with you, the way I once had to sit with it myself, in the back row, clapping, and waiting for the moment I knew, with absolute certainty, was already mine to win. I think about that back row often, even now, years later, with my own name on my own building and my own team building things I couldn't have imagined on that first sleepless night at my workbench. I don't think about it with anger anymore, not really. The anger did its job, sharpened into strategy, and then, once it had accomplished what it needed to, quietly retired, the way anger sometimes does when it's finally allowed to finish its work. What I think about now, instead, is the particular stillness I found in that chair, week after week, clapping for something that was never supposed to be anyone's but mine. I think about how much strength it actually takes to wait, deliberately, patiently, while someone else stands in a spotlight you built for them without ever meaning to. If there's one thing I'd want anyone reading this to carry away, more than the satisfaction of watching a thief lose everything, it's this: the waiting isn't weakness. The documentation isn't paranoia. The quiet, unglamorous discipline of keeping receipts, filing first, trusting carefully, that discipline is not the opposite of courage. It is, in its own patient, unshowy way, one of the bravest things a person can do. It was, for me, the bravest thing I've ever done, braver even than the deposition, braver than the lawsuit, braver than watching Marcus Fenwick's face collapse under the weight of his own recorded words. The bravery happened earlier than that, quietly, alone, on my kitchen floor at 1 a.m, deciding not to scream, and choosing, instead, to build a case so complete that screaming would never actually be necessary. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, keep the receipts. See you in the next one.